and get started. First off, I want to thank everyone for their participation with the outside speaker this week. We had a great turnout at seminar, and Dr. Fay over and over again expressed how much he enjoyed his visit and how much he enjoyed meeting with everybody that he was able to meet with, and was really happy with the group of folks that we have here in the department. So I think it was a great visit for everybody. Josh Harvey has placed a thank you note in the main office. If anybody who wishes could stop by and sign the thank you note, he'll pick it up at the end of the day and send that off to Dr. Fay. Okay, so I'll remind you again, please go ahead and sign in. We're keeping track of attendance in seminar now, so make sure you sign in, and then we'll go ahead and get started. We've got 2 talks today. Both are master's proposal talks. Both are fish related, so we will get started with Travis Rehm, who comes to us from an undergrad at Montana State, currently working with the USGS co-op unit in Dr. Chips's lab. And Travis will tell us today about the influence of fish density on growth rate of brown trout in Spearfish Creek. And just stay relatively close to the microphone for the West River folks.
That's right here.
Yeah. And then after we take questions for a minute, we'll specifically ask them for questions.
Sounds great. All right, hey everybody. My name is Travis Rehm. As is said, my advisor is Dr. Stephen Chips, and I'm here to talk to you today about my work, the influence of fish density on the growth rate of brown trout in Spearfish Creek, South Dakota. So, as I'm sure most of you are aware, the Black Hills are located on that western edge of South Dakota, on the Wyoming border. And Spearfish Creek is located within the Black Hills. It's a freestone stream with an annual mean discharge of about 54 CFS. It flows north out of the Black Hills, through the town of Spearfish, and it's a tributary of the Redwater. So, Spearfish, the creek, and the town both derive their name from Native Americans spearing large migrations of white suckers on their annual spring spawning runs. So prior to European settlement, the only fish species known to inhabit the Black Hills were suckers, chubs, and days. Now, the first fish that were stocked within Spearfish Creek were brook trout. This was in 1886. And by 1896, there was a thriving population within the creek. The U.S. Fisheries Commission stocked rainbows, brook trouts, brown trout, and cutthroat through 1890 to 1896. And the first brown trout were stocked within the creek in 1890. So this was only 7 years after brown trout were brought over from Germany. So soon after brown trout entered America, they were being stocked within Spearfish Creek and the Black Hills. So trout management has evolved over the years in the Black Hills, and in the early 1900s to about 1960, trout were managed as a put-and-take fishery, heavy stocking operations, and since then it's morphed into a more wild trout management. And now today, Spearfish Creek is exclusively managed as a wild trout fishery. So trout angling provides important angling opportunities to anglers of the hills, and about 85% of anglers view trout as an important part of their angling experience. So today, Spearfish Creek hosts a robust population of brown trout and one of 2 naturally reproducing rainbow trout fisheries within the hills. So Spearfish Creek's biomass is about 3 times greater than comparable Black Hills streams. As you can see here, Castle and Rapid, they're also Black Hills trout streams. And this is biomass of adult brown trout. So we're talking trout over 200 millimeters. And it's very clear that there's a very big disparity in abundance here. And just having a higher abundance of adult brown trout in Spearfish Creek. However, that size of adult brown trout is about 30% smaller than comparable, again here, this is Rapid Creek. And as you can see, growth rates at age 1 and age 2 are pretty much on par. But once those trout mature and get to age 3, we're looking at a really diminished growth rate. And it's pretty easy to see the dichotomy here. So what we have in the creek is a high density, high biomass, and reduced growth rates. And what we're seeing is fish like this in year 1 and 2, very good condition. And then when we get to that 3 plus, and this is most likely a 3 plus brown trout, we're seeing fish in much lower condition. The growth rate's reduced and also condition of those trout. So the mechanism believed to be behind this high abundance, high biomass, reduced growth rate, and reduced size structure is density-dependent growth rates. Now, density-dependent growth rates are known to be present in stream-flowing brown trout populations. And what I'm trying to show you in this slide is there's a lot of literature supporting this phenomenon. Now, this is one of the, taken from one of those papers I just showed you. It's the relationship between trout density and average trout size. Now, that arrow there represents Spearfish Creek. And as you can see, it's on that right side of the spectrum. And reducing densities would, in theory, increase our mean size by a decent amount. So we have this high biomass, high density system with reduced growth rates. Why don't we just liberalize regulations and let our anglers do the work for us? Well, Black Hills anglers generally harvest few trout. And creel surveys show that in particular, very few trout are harvested in Spearfish Creek. Now, the harvest rates in those creel surveys don't even show them coming up to their creel limits, and not for lack of angler success, more of lack of angler harvest. And really due to the social stigma, the culture associated with trout fishing, liberalizing regulations would most likely do very little to increase harvest, and increase harvest to the levels we would need to actually see those reductions in abundance where we could see improved growth rates. So again, due to this high fish abundance, slow growth, and low angler harvest, and really low potential for angler harvest, one management strategy for improving those growth rates and improving size structure is density manipulations. And what I'm talking about is localized reductions in brown trout. Now, these localized reductions, we would anticipate they reduce intraspecific competition and then increase those growth rates of those 3 plus brown trout I showed you earlier. So an important metric to keep our eyes on would be, what are those trout going to do? Are they going to stay put? Are they going to move from these high density areas to these newly found low density areas? Now, recent work has shown by James et al. In 2007 that brown trout, again in Rapid Creek, another comparable Black Hills stream, those brown trout move very little. They have small home ranges, and the only really large movements we see is during the fall migrations for spawning. So with that, what I'm trying to do is to determine the effects of a 50% reduction in brown trout over 100 millimeters on the growth, abundance, and condition of age 0, 1, and 2 plus trout. And secondly, compare those movements and fidelity of brown trout in those experimental sections of streams, so those 50% reductions, those localized reduction areas, and then our control groups. So we broke Spearfish Creek up into 2 reaches, and as you can see here, the city reach and the canyon reach. Now, they're separated by a dewatered section, and there's functionally no conductivity between the two. And the dewatered section starts right here at what they call Maurice Intake, and ends down here at the southern end of that city reach at a hydropower plant at the, like I say, at the start of the town of Spearfish. So within these 2 reaches, we picked 14 sections, and these are quarter-mile sections, so 425 meters, so very, very large. And between these sections, there's at least another quarter-mile buffer zone to mitigate any movements between our experimental and our control sites. Now, out of those 14, 50% of them were randomly selected to serve as our control site, or our experimental sites. The other 7 then serve as our control. Now, 4 of the sites were selected to be in the town reach that I just showed you, and that's that hydropower plant right at the top end of town in here. And then, as you can see, the reach ends just in here, and that's the end of Spearfish the town. And so they're well distributed throughout town. EX is indicating those experimental groups that I talked about, and C is indicating those control groups. So, and then we have the canyon reach, which is spatially much bigger and houses the remaining 10 sections. Again, indicating EX is that experimental and C is our control. So that Maurice intake I talked about is located right about there. And then the top end of this reach is Cheyenne Crossing. So again, you can see they're pretty well distributed throughout the reach. It's clearly much larger reach than our town reach, housing 10 of those sites. Oh, and I should say, so the sites in town, 4 of them, 2 experimental, 2 control, 50%, and within our canyon reach, 10 of them, 5 experimental and 5 control sites. So when we went to sampling these sites, the methods we used were to enclose the top and bottom of each section with a block net, and this was basically to mitigate moving in and out of those sampling sites during those sampling events. We would then do a 3-pass electrofishing survey. Fish captured would be taken to the top, to just above that top block net, placed in a net pen where there's another group of individuals working fish. They would anesthetize these fish, weigh and measure to the nearest gram and millimeter, and then identify by species. So after these fish were worked up, they would be then placed back into those net pens and let recover. So during a control group, we would finish our 3-pass electrofishing. Those individuals at top would finish working up those fish. We would then remove those block nets, and then the fish would be placed back into the stream, and we'd be good to go. There's a little more work on those experimental groups. Now, in an experimental group, we would finish those 3-pass electrofishing surveys and working fish, and then I myself would do a population estimate using the 3-pass depletion, and then we would get that population estimate and in the estimate is fish over 100 millimeters, and we would take the 50% of those fish over 100 millimeters via hatchery truck to either Iron Creek Lake or Hannah Pond. These are both popular fishing destinations within the hills. And it was used as supplemental stocking for these 2 still waters, with a subsample of those trout being taken for age growth analysis. Now, we took 35 fish per 100 millimeter bin in those experimental groups that I was just talking about, and then 5 per 100 millimeter bin in our control groups. So after we collect that initial data, do our treatments, and then come back and do post-evaluation, we're going to be using a Bakke study design. So before, after control, and impact, to evaluate those changes in growth, abundance, and condition of those trout. So as I'm sure a lot of you are aware, the Bakke design uses a sampling event before, an impact, in our case that's the 50% reduction in trout, and then sampling events after. And in this case, there's a control and impact, and in our hypothetical situation, control could be higher in the watershed, and we see any number of random events happen. Say there's siltation here due to road construction, and we see a decrease in abundance, or whatever it may be. That's not going to show up at the control, and we're going to account that to our impact site. So what we do to combat that is we have many spatial replication, and that's hence the 7 and 7. We can compare multiple control sites against multiple experimental sites and tease out those if our treatments are actually having effect on that growth, abundance, and condition of those trout. So onto that objective number 2, that the movement and fidelity of those brown trout. In total, we're going to be implanting 40 radio tags, and these radio tags are implanted when we put those fish under anesthesia, MS222, and then the radio tags implanted are the ATS 1550s. They have a life of about 156 days. Now, in order to compare our experimental sites and our control sites and the movement fidelity between those two. We're going to be tagging at least one trout in each section, each tagging event. And I'll explain those tagging events here in a second. These fish will be tracked at a rate of twice weekly. And then in 2016, initially we tagged 20 trout in the late summer, and they're being tracked until the life of the tag. And then again, we're going to tag 20 more trout in 2017 in the spring, going through the end of the summer. So the spatial distribution of those trout locations is going to be analyzed using SAT-SCAN. This is going to help us evaluate changes in net movement, spatial clustering, and calculate those home ranges. And then compare those metrics against our control sites and our experimental sites. So just to give you a little rundown of the field work, and clearly 2016 has happened. Those initial densities, growth rates, and condition were collected from all 14 sites. Then the 7 experimental sites that I talked about received those 50% removals in brown trout over 100 millimeters. That subset of otoliths, 35 per 100 millimeter bin in our experimentals, and 5 per 100 millimeter bin in our controls was taken. And then those initial 20 radio tags were implanted in those trout. Now in 2017, we plan on coming back and evaluating the post-reduction growth, abundance, and condition of all of those 14 sites. Again, taking a subsample of fish to be used for age growth analysis, and implanting 20 more radio tags in the spring, as I just talked about. So moving forward, currently those otoliths I talked about in that subsample are being analyzed, and a side project, so the morphometric measurements of trout taken in our experimental groups are being used to individually sex brown trout. And this is being finished up, and my technician, Kelson Young, will be presenting the results at this year's Dakota chapter of AFS. And then, as I said, those initial 20 radio tags are being tracked through the end of their lives, and we are starting to lose a couple, and probably will by the beginning of February, end of February. So with that, I'd like to thank my funding sources, South Dakota Game Fish and Parks, of course, South Dakota State University, the South Dakota Fish and Wildlife Cooperative Unit, USGS, and then the Spearfish Restoration Program. And I'd also like to thank South Dakota Game Fish and Parks, the Rapid City office. They provided a lot of manpower. These were large sampling events. We had 10 to 15 people a day, and they just provided a lot of help. The McNinney hatchery staff, they let me live on site and provided guys when they could. Big thanks to Jake Davis, Ryan Anvik, and Greg Simpson. Our very own Seth Fatma, him and his crew helped with a lot of sampling this summer. And then, of course, my technician, Kelson Young. So with that, I'd love to take any questions, and thank you for your time.
Did all 20 of your radio kayak fish survive through December?
Well, we know that at least 1 or 2 died, and then it's tough because a lot of these brown trout don't move a lot, and like I thought one was dead, and my technician literally saw the fish rise with the tag hanging out of him. So I think most of them are alive, but it's hard to tell because a few of them kind of like the holes they're living in. So to be determined, I suppose.
Are you going to reassess population density in 2017 to make sure it's still the same between years?
Yeah. All those sites will be sampled just as they were in 2016. The same way, only we won't be doing removals. So, yep.
Are you anticipating any differences between the residential stream areas and the canyon stream areas in response to growth?
I wasn't, but then after sampling them, the town section has a much bigger size class, and I didn't include that data, and now that's legitimately the only real data I have thus far. But the densities are a little lower, and the size class is actually bigger. So it's going to be interesting if we can push the town size class out compared to the canyon reach, which is actually much smaller. There's lower densities and bigger fish in town, really, which I didn't anticipate happening, but that's what we found.
You mentioned the software that you will be using for your data analysis, but what kinds of models will you be testing with your analysis?
You know, I have just started to get into that a little. I've been reading StatScan, but to tell you the truth, that's to be continued for me. Just working on that.
Okay. Why don't you ask if there's any questions?
Oh, is there any? Can they hear me?
Yeah,
Is there any questions from West River?
of course. Remote people.
First pass, it's just pass.
So question from Mike, what are the fish eating and how does that change per size class?
Perfect. So, and I haven't done a lot of work on that, but initial stuff done by Dan James shows that initially those trout are eating a lot of annelids. There's a lot of diptera larvae, but once they get to that age 3 and they get that past that 200 millimeters, they really try to shift over to terrestrials. And I'm assuming that's the limitations. It's an interesting stream. There's not a lot of interstitial space. It calcifies, especially the canyon section. So the macro invert density or diversity is tougher. There's not as many caddisflies, mayflies. There's a lot of small mayflies, betas and such. But that might be our bottleneck for those fish getting large right now and those young fish doing so well.
Any other questions? All right, I think I'm going to start.